All right, hello everybody. Welcome to this deep dive webinar I'm very excited about. We have Joosten with us, one of the world's foremost experts on peatlands, and I'm very excited to hear what he has to share. Hey, how you doing, Hans?
I'm doing fine. Yes.
Very good. We got a lot of people here. It looks like most of them, a lot of them in the comments here are from the Netherlands, except Gabrielle says she's in France, not a Dutch speaker. So not everybody speaks Dutch. You can't just do it in Dutch. You want to say a little bit more about yourself before we dive in? I know you have a presentation you're going to give, and then I know we're going to have lots of great questions. So I want to remind everybody at the Q&A box there on your screen, you can click that and type in your questions as you think of them, and we'll collect them for afterwards. And I'm sure we'll have some great discussions about this really important topic. So Hans, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, a little bit about myself. I'm originally Dutch. I'm still Dutch, actually. I have Dutch nationality, but I'm living already 22 years here in Germany. And I'm currently a professor in peatland studies and paleoecology. So somebody who is professionally busy with studying peatlands. Paleoecology is the study of the past, of past ecosystems. And the linkage with peatlands is that peatlands are very nice archives of the past. Peatlands grow and they accumulate all kinds of information in them. And it is my business to get this information out and to reconstruct vegetation history, climate history, cultural history, etc., etc. So next to that, I'm a devoted nature conservationist. I have been that all my life. Some weeks ago, we had the 40th celebration of the 40th birthday of a peatland conservation group in the Netherlands that I have founded. And I have ever been since active in nature conservation. I'm almost 20 years the Secretary General of the International Mire Conservation Group, that is the world organization of peatland conservationists. And within peatland conservation, I have done all kinds of things, specifically on a worldwide level, been involved in a lot of conventions in the last 10 years, very much in the climate convention. I have been official negotiator for the Republic of Belarus in the climate convention. And I have managed to bring peatlands under the Kyoto Protocol and under the tropical reducing emissions from deforestation, etc., etc. So I like peatlands. I love peatlands. I'm very much interested in peatlands. I'm limited to peatlands, but my limitations are very wide. So I'm interested in everything that has to do with peatlands, and also with people, etc., etc. So that's a little bit of my background. I live here in a very small village here in northern Germany, together with my wife. My children have left home. They are already 32 and 30. So I live on a peninsula in the Baltic Sea, next to a marine transgression mire, a special type of peatland.
Wonderful. Okay, well, let's learn about peatlands. What are peatlands, Hans?
Yeah, I can explain you a little bit about peatlands. I have prepared rapidly a PowerPoint presentation that I want to share with you with an enormous amount of pictures and text. So if it is getting too long and too troublesome and too not interesting enough, you simply, I have to share, I think, my thing. Can I do that? Oh,
share.
I have to give it. Wait a minute.
It was in German. I forget the.
Yes, but something comes.
Okay, now I see your stuff.
You see it?
Yes.
You see the presentation now?
Oh yeah, Peatlands and Civilization from Mythology to Climate Change. Exciting.
Okay, you can read it then, and I show the pictures. Now, you asked me to tell a little bit about mythology and peatlands and my background. It has to do with the fact it's one of our research projects to find out more about how people have been thinking and approaching peatlands and wetlands in the past. And then we must observe that certainly in the recent past, the societal perception of wetlands and peatlands has largely been negative. We have a lot of expressions in English like bogged down and mired and swamped, etc., that have a negative connotation. I'm actually convinced that it has not been always this case. I quote here some text, some old texts. All the lands were sea, and Gilima bound reeds upon the face of the waters. He formed soil and poured that beside the reeds. He filled in a dike by the side of the sea, and he made a swamp. Reeds he formed, and trees he created. This is a Sumerian creation myth of 4,500 years old. In the cradle of our civilization, the area where the writing has been invented and where actually a lot of our culture had its cradle, swamps were an incredible important part of life, up to the extent that the first map that I thought to exist of the world comes from this area. This is actually a map from 800 BC, but my collaborator just informed me an hour ago that he has found an older map with swamps and peatlands on it from Babylonia from 1500 BC. So a map of 3,500 years old, illustrating the importance of wetlands, swamps, and peatlands for the cradle of our culture. This peatlands and their culture still exist, or I must say again exist. This is the area where the Euphrates and the Tigris comes together in the Shat al-Arab area, where you have extensive wetlands, peatlands, where a special people lived already for thousands of years, the Madan, and they were called the Moor Arabs. And they were killed off by Saddam Hussein after the second Gulf War. But since Saddam Hussein has himself been get rid of restoration activities of these swamps that have been drained by Saddam Hussein has started, and also the people and this culture is coming back. So when we think about the position of peatlands in our area, then we must be aware that in pre-Neolithic times, before agriculture started to cut away the forests, peatlands were actually the only open spots in the landscape where you could walk. Of course, there were other open spots like lakes and seas and rivers, but we have never learned to walk over water, and peatlands were the only open places in the landscape where you could walk. And furthermore, that is a very nice experience if you are in such open peatland. Whatever shape this peatland has, the horizon has always a circle form, meaning that you are in that time standing in the middle of what was considered to be the perfect form, the circle. And that must have had an enormous impact on people, this openness and this circle form. We can hardly imagine what the importance is of openness, because we are all accustomed to openness. In my earliest youth, when I was 20, I had spent some months in the tropical rainforest with the pygmies of southeast Cameroon, and I had been very much been influenced by these people and very much inspired. And later I read a lot of books about pygmies, including the forest people of anthropologist Colin Turnbull, and he has actually brought it to the point what the issue is of living in a forest, and you have a completely different perspective as people who are living in the open. And that he became aware of that when he took one of his friend pygmies, Kenge, to the Ruwenzori mountains, and they were climbing the mountains up to above the tree line, and they could see very far away, and in the savanna below them, and there was a large herd of buffaloes grazing. And then this pygmy Kenge, he saw the buffalo, and he said they were still grazing miles away. He asked then Colin Turnbull, what insects are those? Because he could not imagine that something that was so far away was so small. And this is the perspective that you get of openness. If you live in the forest, and you can see 10, 20 meters far away, but not farther. So peatlands must have been created very important experiences for people living in the forest, because this was the only place where there was an open connection between the sky above, and the skies have always been important, and the underworld, and there were in all these cultures also underworlds below, and you could walk over that, and this sky above, the heavens and the underworld, they were separated by something that they could call, in a very old Indo-Germanic word, suop. And this word suop is a word where a lot of other concepts are derived from. The suop is also the basis of our word swamp, but there's also the word suo in Suomi, Finland. It is the basis of the word zweven in Dutch, or schweben in German, means floating. It is the basis of soup. So it is all this unstable land what you have. And this was an area where you could walk, where you could be intermediate between the sky above and the underworld below. So we see that in all times, peatlands have been very important for spirituality. We find incredibly many findings, archaeological findings of weapons, of gold in peatlands, including the including the bog bodies. And research illustrates now more and more all the bog bodies that we have found, they are deliberately put in the peatland. And most of them, if not all of them, have been killed, and very many of them have been killed several times. It is not enough, apparently, for a bog body to be strangled like this, a bog body, Tolundman from Denmark, 2,700 years old. It has been strangled, and the throat has been cut, but there are other bodies that also have been beaten completely. And so apparently this was part of the dealing with the transition between life and death, which was a very weak and vague, diffuse transition, so that the people that were sacrificed had to die multiple deaths to express that. But at the same time, and that was also consciously being done by the people, they were put in a peatland where they would be conserved forever. And we know that because these same areas have been revisited time and again, illustrating the memory that existed with respect to these sacrifices and these spiritual places of peatlands. So this is a little bit introduction into peatlands, and I want to jump to other spiritual and important things nowadays. And that is, of course, the issue with climate change. And we all know that the latest 19 years were the 18 warmest years on record, with increasing risks for food and water security, and that disasters have triggered enormous amounts of deaths and very high losses in money. Also, the frequency and severity of disasters have since 1950 increased to the extent that insurance companies have to pay 5 times more nowadays than in the past with respect to these natural disasters, which are, of course, human-made. It are these developments that we have agreed, and have agreed all of them, that have to stop. I have, as I said, worked a long time in the Climate Convention, and of course you can be very frustrated of what is happening there, that it's not going fast enough and not going intensively enough. But I incredibly appreciate what is happening there, because you cannot imagine the challenge that exists when you have to decide about issues that are influencing all world and all countries with such incredible differences in interest, and you have to decide unanimously what to do. In former times we would have had, I do not know how many wars about these issues. Our society is at the moment managing, not effectively yet, but laying the basis of dealing with enormous challenges of the world in a concerted way. As I said, the Paris Agreement has actually made the world more simple than before, because we have something that we have never had. we have one common goal, and in terms of climate, this is expressed as being trying to keep it lower than 2 degrees. And this is part of a bigger agenda, which we call the Sustainable Development Goals, because the issue is clear. From a climate point of view, and the latest IPCC report has stressed that very clearly, if we want to keep climate change under 1.5 degrees or under 2 degrees, we have to reach 0 net emissions of CO2 by 2050. And other gases must be reduced substantially. This is a new world that we have entered. In the past, we were talking about reductions of 60% or 80%, and then everybody said, yeah, I'm too important to reduce 80%, I can only do less, so somebody else has to do more. But if you have to reach 0, it means that everybody has to reach 0, and all levels of organization, you have to reach 0. You, me, this house, this village, this city, this country, this world. And we are all having the same goal. We all have to go to 0 in the next 30 years. And this is an enormous challenge, but it is you can call a democratic challenge, because everybody has to fulfill it. The Paris Agreement, similar to the Sustainable Development Goal, says that we cannot only focus on climate. Climate is, of course, a very important issue, but there are much other important values involved. And these are expressed in the Sustainable Development Goals, and in the Paris Agreement, it is expressed in a sentence in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. By the way, this picture I made 1 week before and 60 kilometers from the place where North Korea exploded its first hydrogen bomb. This is a picture from North Korea, where there are also very interesting peatlands and very much poverty, as you can see. Good, for peatland, it means that we have to break radically with wrong developments from the past. That is clear. To explain you a little bit about what peatlands are, of course you all know that, but it is good to remember peatlands, or what we call mires. We have in Europe the word mires to express living peatlands. In North America, you do not use this word mires because you said it's the same as peatlands. But for example, in Europe, more than half of all the peatlands have been destroyed to the extent that they are not actively accumulating peat anymore. In Canada, still 98% of the peatlands are still peat accumulating. So there it makes not so much sense to differentiate. But in many parts of the world, it makes sense to differentiate between peatlands as land with peat, and mires being peatlands where still peat accumulation is taking place. This peat accumulation is taking place because the biomass production is larger than the decay of it. And these plants, they accumulate then as a substance that we call peat. And here on the picture, you see how mosses change under influence of water, conserving water, to this darker stuff, which we call peat. Peat accumulates actually only because of water saturation. Peatlands are always wetlands, and really wetlands, not humid, but wet. And if a peatland is allowed to continue growing, it accumulates peat over thousands of years in meter-thick layers that contain very much carbon. We find actually peatlands in almost every country of the world, worldwide some 4 million square kilometers. And this map illustrates a little bit the distribution of peatlands per country, and the darker the more peat, and in the gray areas, these are areas where we until now have not found peat yet, except for Southeast Asia. This has been filled now. It is not up to date, this map yet. So these peatlands you can actually find in every country, but not in the same extent. But also the diversity of peatlands is so large that a lot of peatlands are not recognized as peatlands. So we find them in the tundra, we would call this tundra, but here these are polygon mires, very fascinating mires. These are actually my favorite mires for studying them. I like to study how these are functioning. So this is a peatland in the tundra, and it looks completely different from a peatland in the tropics, which has 60 meters large trees on 16 meters of peat. This is a peatland only 1,000 kilometers from Antarctica, dominated by one moss species, Sphagnum magellanicum. It is close to the Strait of Magellan. Of course, this reddish moss with very fascinating patterns. So in the high mountains, like here in the Andes, we find peatlands where the vegetation has adapted to ultraviolet radiation, has very strange forms. And we even find peatlands in the sea, like here in the Baltic Sea near Arkhangelsk. We find peatlands, you can travel very far to find peatlands, but we also find peatlands in the middle of the city, like here in Vancouver, Burnsburg in Canada. And also in Greifswald, we just have measured it up. We have 600 hectares of peatlands in the city of Greifswald. So you can find them everywhere. As I already noticed, peatlands have for a long time not been appreciated. They have been the scenery of all kinds of ugly stories like The Hound of the Baskervilles from Conan Doyle. And also in politics and in policy making, this issue of not being appreciated has been apparent for a long time. In the Ramsar Convention in 1996, this has been called the Cinderella syndrome. As Cinderella, something that is very important for the household, but not being recognized on its virtue and on its values. And we had the same actually with peatlands for a very long time. You can simply say for the Ramsar Convention, the Wetland Convention, they were too dry. For the Biodiversity Convention, they were too monotonous. For the Climate Convention, they were too small. For the Desertification Convention, they were too wet. For all of us, they were too frightful. And for all of us, they were too unknown to be appreciated. We have, as a very nice example, the Ramsar Convention, and the Wetland Convention that started in 1971. But the Ramsar Convention has managed in the first 25 years of its existence completely to overlook peatlands. And that is fascinating because we found a few years ago that the city of Ramsar is surrounded by peatlands. We even caught, and this is a picture of it, this is my collaborator Elias Ramazani, we caught peat in the park belonging to the hotel on the background where the Ramsar Convention started, where it was undersigned. It was so abundant there that it was not recognized. So peatlands, as I already illustrated, are very special and biodiverse, and therefore you would expect that they would also be the subject of the Biodiversity Convention, but it has for a long time not happened, and that is specifically a pity, not only because peatland plants are very highly adapted, like this insect catching sundew from Argentina, but they have also a fascinating ecosystem biodiversity. In the same way as that we in life manage with only 4 base pairs, make an enormous diversity of species, in the same way a peatland manages with a few species to create an enormous diversity on an ecosystem level. That is, for example, expressed in impressive self-organizing patterns. This landscape is completely organic, is completely peat, but you see this patterning that arranges itself through self-organization. And this aspect we discover more and more. It is not limited to this scale of a few kilometers, but there are even self-organization patterns. You can see them also in the Hudson Bay lowlands or in the Red Lake peatlands in Minnesota, and that these patterns that you can only discover by satellite. Here you see, I simply give this indicator of scale 1 kilometer, but you see here patterns of kilometers large. This is a completely organic peat landscape. There is no mineral soil involved, and over thousands of years it has created these patterns. So this biodiversity aspect has completely been neglected by the Biodiversity Convention. Now, peatlands have a lot of other issues. For example, in the Andes, and most of the big cities that you have there, be it Bogota or Lima or whatever, they all get their water from the paramos in the Andes, the peatland areas in the high mountains. Peatlands, and that is also not recognized, have a very interesting aspect. When the peat is dry, the heat conductivity is 5 times smaller than when it is wet and 25 times smaller than when it is frozen. And in this way, peat creates permafrost, even in areas where it could not exist. And we find permafrost under peatlands in climates that have an annual average temperature of 2 degrees. And that is done by peatlands. They create and maintain permafrost. Peatlands are, like all wetlands, important to connect biodiversity internationally and intercontinentally, and of course they provide a lot of livelihood for indigenous peoples, etc. So peatlands are from all kinds important. Of course, peatlands get more and more attention in the last 10 years because of their climate function. And there is a lot of fairy tales around. We can simply say that living peatlands are climatically more or less neutral, or at most slowly cooling. It depends on how you address it. It has to do with the fact that living peatlands are CO2 sinks. They absorb CO2, change it into plant biomass, and that is conserved as peat. But this conservation only takes place because of water saturation. And under this water saturation, part of this organic material is broken down anaerobically and produces methane. That is not so much from a volume, but because methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas, these two fluxes of CO2 and methane, they balance each other out, making peatlands actually more or less neutral. Also, the carbon sequestration capacity of peatlands is not that large. It is a slow process. The entire peatlands of the world that are still growing, they only accumulate carbon to the extent that equals 1% of our carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels. So peatlands will not save the world. You cannot expect that peatlands will solve our problems. We will have to solve our problems ourselves, but we should not increase the problems. And that is also relevant for peatlands, because more important than this direct exchange is the carbon stock that peatlands have built up over all these thousands of years. Peatlands are simply the most space-effective carbon stores of all terrestrial ecosystems. There is no ecosystem that has more carbon per hectare in the terrestrial biosphere than peatlands. You can hardly imagine it, but a 15 centimeters layer of peat, so that is such a small peat layer that we would not even call it a peatland, but 15 centimeters of peat contains per hectare already more carbon than a high carbon stock tropical forest. It is really dense material. So whereas they only cover 3% of the world's land area, peatlands contain more than 500 gigaton of carbon. And then you all say that is an enormous much. No, you don't say that because you have no idea how much a gigaton of carbon is. I always say we do not have a gigaton at home, so we have no imagination how much a gigaton is. And we can only approach that by comparison. And more than 500 gigaton of carbon is twice the carbon stock of the world's total forest biomass. And these forests are situated on 30% of the world's land. So 3% of the land being peatlands has double as much carbon than 30% of the area being forests. That is the density of carbon in peat. So the trick is of peat, it is conserved because of water saturation in combination often with a little bit acidity. So it is like atja campur, as we say it in the Netherlands. It is the colonial Indonesian background, or in Germany we call that spreewaldgurke. As long as you leave the stuff in the pot, it is conserved. When you get it out and put it on the table and leave it there for a few weeks, it is gone. Yeah, so it is rotten away, and that is what is happening on a large scale in the world. A deeply drained grassland on peat in Germany, but the same is also in the Netherlands, emits 29 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. again, a number you can do nothing with it. You have to compare it, that is equal to driving 145,000 kilometers with a middle class car. So this is incredibly much. Oil palm on peat in the tropics emits 16 tons, equals 300,000 kilometers per car, every hectare every year. So 1 hectare of oil palm contains sufficient carbon to fly 50 times from Amsterdam to Jakarta, 50 times per hectare. So these are enormous amounts of greenhouse gases that are going from a small area of land into our atmosphere. And globally, only 0.4% of the land contains drained peatlands in the world, but they produce 2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, or 5% of all global emissions. And that is so in average. If we have heavy fires, then in some years it is even much more. So in Indonesia, the peat fires in 2015, they killed probably 100,000 people, brought 500,000 people in the hospital, and caused something between 20 and 40 billion US dollars of local damage. So it is really a global issue, this stuff. Indonesia is indeed the top emitter from drained peatlands in the world, even when you do not calculate these enormous peatland fires, because also this microbial oxidation from drained peatlands produce more carbon dioxide than the fires that are catastrophic, but they are incidental. So Indonesia is the most important emitter of peatland carbon dioxide, but what is often forgotten, the European Union is a good second. And the European Union is discussing, for example, now in its Renewable Energy Directive, the possibility to almost completely forbid palm oil to be imported to the European Union, saying that palm oil is responsible for a lot of drainage of peatlands. This is indeed so, but in the same time, in the same decision, they allow products from drained peatlands to be accepted as biofuel under the Renewable Energy Directive in the European Union. So there's a lot of injustice, a lot of neo-colonialistic injustice in this relation between countries and peatlands. So this is a map we made 2 years ago about the peatlands emissions per country, showing that most emissions come from countries like Indonesia and Russia. But other countries are also very important. So in some countries, peatlands emit even more than fossil fuels and cement together, including Papua New Guinea, Burundi, Iceland, Mongolia, Zambia, and Finland. There, peatlands belong to the most important emitters of carbon dioxide at all. And even 25 countries, peatlands emit more than 50% compared to their emissions from fossil fuels and cement, including a country like Uganda, and where at the moment large areas of peatlands are being drained for agriculture because of the population pressure. So when we talk about land use as a source of emissions from peatlands, and then it is clear that peatlands produce a substantial part of all emissions that are coming from agriculture. Agriculture produces emissions in form of methane by burping cows and rice, and nitrous oxide from fertilization. And this is all over large areas, but the small areas of peatlands that are under agriculture in the world are responsible for 30% of all emissions of the entire agricultural sector. You can also monitorize it, and we have done that in Germany. In Germany, peatland agriculture causes an annual climate damage of 3.6 billion euros, according to official figures. And interestingly, it gets 300 million euro grants from the European Union in the framework of cross-compliance. So it's very interesting. Farmers are paid to bring damage to the climate. Another example from Europe, and I can easily see that because there are a lot of Europeans on the line now, we have biogas that is produced from mires. But when this mires, what is happening on a large scale, is produced on peat, then it causes 8 times more climate damage than burning brown coal, lignite. but interestingly, it receives green energy subventions. So we see that the polluter pays principle is put on the head as far as peatlands are concerned, and we pay peatland agriculture for causing massive climate damage, and in this way we frustrate sensible solutions. When we talk about climate damage, this is only one of the societal damages created by peatland drainage. I will illustrate a few more. For example, in continental regions, the east of Ukraine, where now a lot of problems are taking place, there peatland drainage creates deserts. Drainage leads to an irreversible change of the peat soil, so that soils are created that look like stone and cannot support any plant grow anymore. You see that the only green plants are growing directly next to the watercourse, but nothing anymore on the surface of the peatland. In Mongolia, we experience that we get, after overgrazing of large extents of peatlands, they have very much peatlands in Mongolia, but it is a dry area, and this overgrazing leads to erosion of peatlands and a direct desertification after overgrazing of these peatlands. Overgrazing is generally a big problem all over the world in mountainous peatlands, including here in the Tibetan plateau, where we have done a lot of work, where you get as a result peat erosion, decreasing production, floods, and all kinds of associated problems, including desertification, upland desertification, because the groundwater levels are lowered. So it is a complex of factors dealing with peatland drainage. One issue that is, of course, important for the Netherlands, which is not enough recognized, but the Netherlands is changing its attitude. I saw that today already in Vrij Nederland and in the Volkskrant, there were journal articles about the problem of subsiding peatlands and emissions from peatlands from the Netherlands. This is a picture from the Netherlands. This is a bunker that was built just for the Second World War, and it was built on peat, and the peat has disappeared, has subsided, but Dutch people are creative people. They use it to keep the wood dry nowadays. So drainage leads to subsidence. You lose organic material and you lower the surface. In the temperate zone, like in the Netherlands, this loss of height is approximately 1 to 2 centimeters a year. It is depending on the water level. In some areas of the world, this has been monitored. I have here a picture from Bavaria, where they noticed 3 meters loss since 1836. In the UK, 4 meters loss since 1870. But the Netherlands is the champion of all, because the Netherlands started to drain the peatlands in the western part of the country already 1,000 years ago. And if you have 1 meter and 1 centimeter of subsidence every year, and you do it for 1,000 years, that is 1,000 centimeters being 10 meters. And this is indeed the order of magnitude that we must see of subsidence in the Netherlands. So parts between Amsterdam and Rotterdam, as you can see, have subsided already more than 8 meters. This is the way how you change a country from above sea level to a country in below sea level. And indeed, nowadays, 26% of the land area is under sea level, and an additional 29% is threatened by flooding by the rivers because they are laying so low. So we see the frightening situation that whereas the sea level is rising, we bog the peatlands down. And this cannot continue. In the tropics, the problem is because of high temperatures, the rate of subsidence is 5 times faster. It is not 1 centimeter, but 4 or 5 centimeters. And this really leads to problems because a lot of the peatlands in the world are coastal and low-lying. In the last years, we have been mapping the peatlands in the Caribbean, and you see they are all laying next to the coast, and the same is in Southeast Asia. Peninsula Malaysia, Sumatra, Borneo, Sarawak, also Malaysia, Kalimantan, the Indonesian part of Borneo. All these peatlands are situated close to the sea, and all of them that you see now, almost all, have been drained in the last 20 years. Also in America, this is happening. It is not limited to Europe or Southeast Asia. It is not thematized so much, but this is the Jacinto Valley in California, where you have deep subsidence as a result of peat oxidation, increased flooding, and this is the area that provides San Francisco with vegetables. And if Florida is flooding again because of a hurricane, they give them all women names, nobody says that Florida is a peatland, that they have drained for sugarcane production, that is lowering 3 to 4 centimeters a year, and in this way inviting the sea to come in the same way as New Orleans have been created on a peatland. The peatland has, because of drainage, subsided 5 meters. The city is then laying 5 meters below sea level, only separated from the Gulf of Mexico by a small dike, and then you get a small storm and the city drowns, and then you have a natural disaster. No, this is stupidity of human beings dealing wrongly with peatlands. So we estimate that peatland subsidence in the 21st century will lead to uncontrolled flooding of 10 to 20 million hectares of productive land worldwide, to start with on a large scale in Southeast Asia. And that is therefore frightening, because we are losing land in a time that we need it most. And we will not stop population growth until 2050. We still have billions of people who are too poor, they need more, and we have decided in Paris to replace all fossil resources by renewable resources. And these things have to be cultivated. So we are losing land now that we need it most. We have actually a cultural problem, and there I come back, that is very nice, back to the area of the Euphrates and the Tigris, because this is also the area, for Europeans, I always say this is not a map of the distribution of refugees over Europe. This is a map of the distribution of agriculture over Europe. It started in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, in Syria and parts of Turkey, and it spread over Europe. It had actually, our modern agriculture had a semi-desert as a cradle. And since that, it has the idea that productive land must be dry and the soils to be continuously moved to have production. And this is, of course, very strange, because we know that wetlands belong to the most productive ecosystems at all, but we have adopted an agriculture that is based on dryness. We apply these illusions that we have created based on semi-desert experience worldwide to wet organic soils. With the summum of all, this cultivation of aloe vera, you have it in your stuff you put on your skin maybe this morning. Aloe vera is a desert plant that is nowadays in Indonesia cultivated on very deeply drained peatlands with the absolute maximum of emissions that you can imagine. But we are not much better in Europe. We plant semi-arid mite from semi-arid Mexico on drained peatlands in Germany. Good, living peatlands, they still exist. Actually, a lot of peatlands have survived. Only 15% or something like that have been drained. So the big majority is still alive. And even in Poland, I use this picture in Katowice, there are still a lot of living peatlands. But that's not where it is all about. When we talk about peatlands and climate, we talk about cows on drained peatlands, carrots on drained peatlands, forests on drained peatlands, oil palm on drained peatlands, pulpwood on drained peatlands. That is the issue. And happily enough, some consciousness starts to arise even in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, this was in the Financial Journal a few months ago, an important influential journal that says we cannot continue keeping peatland drained for the farmers. And the land is going down, we have enormous problems, we have enormous emissions, and something has to change there. And we know that rewetting solves most of the problems, and interestingly, it also provides additional, what they nowadays are called ecosystem services, useful things for human beings, but also for other ecosystem components. Wet peatlands are cool. They cool the landscape because they ask more energy for evaporation, and therefore less is left for heat. This has been systematically studied in Belarus when they drained the Pripyat mires in the 1960s and the 70s. This has been monitored, and it has been proven that the climate has become hotter because of the drainage of the peatlands. So the rewetting of drained peatlands is an adaptation measure for climate change. We can cope a little bit better with the climate change that we cannot prevent, the part that we cannot prevent by rewetting the peatlands. Peatlands also prove to absorb high water events and reduce peat flow. If you have peatlands that can be flooded, you do not need to flood the cities. So also that will be adaptation in a time that rainfall and dryness will become more intense and more fluctuating. We also notice that if we rewet fen peatlands, we not only make the water storage in the peatland itself better, but also in the catchment area, in the mineral catchment area, and there the groundwater rises also, so it increases groundwater availability, which will be necessary to adapt and to cope with the increasing spells of dryness that climate change will bring. And for myself, this is a picture from behind my house. I live close to the coast, near a coastal flood mire. And the nice thing of these coastal flood mires is they grow up with the rising sea level. They protect themselves and ourselves also when the sea level is not rising too fast, of course. Again, an example of adaptation. So if we look at the challenges of the Paris Agreement, that we have to reach zero net emissions of CO2 by 2050, it means that we have to rewet all drained peatlands in the world. So we will get the age of rewetting. We have to rewet 500,000 square kilometers of peatlands, meaning 20,000 square kilometers per year. An enormous challenge. And in Germany, they have already started. This is the Minister of Environment with active rewetting of a peatland, but it is very clear that this has to be upscaled. In Europe, we have been rewetting peatlands in the last 20, 30 years, but it is very obvious that we have focused on the easy stuff, the things that, the areas that anybody, anyhow, nobody wanted to have. Here, a picture from the blanket bogs of Scotland, which have no really high economic value. There you can do it, and we have done the same on a large scale. What is large? We are busy now with a rewetting project in Russia where we have rewetted 65,000 hectares. This sounds nice, but it is peanuts compared with what we have to do. So we have been focusing on the simple areas which do not lead to a real big reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. If we want to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions, we have to go to the core of the problem, and that is intensive agriculture and forestry on drained peat, not only in the tropics, but also in the temperate zone. I always say Gouda cheese is the Dutch equivalent of palm oil. It is produced on the basis of peatland emissions and subsidence. 1 kilogram of Gouda cheese contains 55 kilograms of CO2, largely coming from drained peatland emissions. So it is a burden that we have because of a production of food. And we have to be aware of that it is happening, that we cannot blame Indonesia for producing palm oil from drained peatland and at the same time be proud on our Gouda cheese that comes from similar drained peatlands. So we have to flood the peatlands of the world, but we cannot flood them all and take them out of production because these areas have been drained for productivity. And I'm the last one who says that we all have to turn them back into wildernesses, how nice it can be, and because we need productivity. And we have to find out how we can combine this conservation of this carbon stock in peatlands while still using these peatlands productively. So we can only solve the drainage problems while maintaining production. So we have to change the attitude from a dry desert drainage-based agriculture into a wetland agriculture. And that is what my group here in Greifswald is studying intensively already for 15, 20 years, and with a lot of good results and also a lot of problems. And we call this type of agriculture paludiculture, wet agriculture and forestry, which has to be developed to solve the problems associated with peatlands. Examples that are already existing are reed cultivation for biomass, etc. And not only for thatching roofs, but we can build incredibly good construction material of reeds. We have installed the first peat moss farms where we cultivate peat moss to replace fossil peat. We use an enormous amount of peat in modern horticulture because simple soil cannot reach the reliability and the high productivity that we need in an urbanized landscape. And that's why we have these greenhouses where they are highly productive on the basis of predictable growing media. And all these growing media are based on peat. You can simply say each of us every day eats peat. There is no vegetable that you can buy in the shop, even not organic vegetables, that have not been cultivated in some part of the life cycle on peat. And yeah, the peat extractors, they go like the last hunter-gatherers of our planet, over the planet, from the one exhausted bog to the other. And we have to stop that, also for climate reasons, but also for biodiversity conservation reasons. And that means that we have to cultivate high quality growing media ourselves. And it appears to be that peat moss can do the job. And it works, as you can see. Yeah, Indonesia has to rewet. It has decided since the last fires. The president has called for an emergency program. It has the president has created a task force directly under responsibility of the president with the task to rewet 2.4 million hectares of peatland until 2020, 24,000 square kilometers. They will not manage it, but they are on their good way. And they say, yeah, but we cannot simply rewet it. They have to be reproductive. They are looking for swamp plants that they can cultivate under wet conditions. And this is an example. This is Joosten with a very high quality rubber that you can cultivate under extremely wet conditions. So for Germany, we have a few months ago sketched a transformation pathway. If we know that in 2050 all the peatlands have to be wet, how do we have to prioritize them? And what you see here are the different land uses: peat extraction, arable land, grassland, forest, settlements, and the rest. And the color indicates the intensity of drainage. Red is very dry, yellow is humid, and green is wet. And we simply say, hey, we have to stop peat extraction in the next 10 years. We have to change all arable land into grassland with higher water levels. We have to make all drained grassland into humid grasslands. In the same way as in Indonesia, they have said, the government has said to the big plantation owners, you have to raise your water level in your palm oil plantations and your pulpwood plantations to 40 centimeters below the surface until the end of this year. And they have forced these companies to do that. With -40, you can still cultivate oil palm, but you halve your emissions and your subsidence. And the government of Indonesia has said, And after this cycle of palm oil is over, and a normal palm oil cycle lasts 25 years, you have to start cultivating crops that are adapted to water-saturated soil conditions. So actually they give the example which we have here used as a pathway for Germany. And we can calculate that what would be then the emissions from these lands, and we have done that, and not accidentally this covers the pathway that the IPCC has given us to reach zero emissions by 2050 and to realize climate change limited to 1.5 degrees. But if you spread the word, and we do nothing else at the moment in Germany and in the world, then in Germany say, yeah, rewetting 400 square kilometers per year until 2050, this is illusory. This is naive what you are saying. You are not realistic. First of all, it is not relevant whether it is possible. It is relevant whether it is necessary, because necessity is the mother of invention. But I also say, why would rewetting 400 square kilometers per year be not possible? Finland managed to drain 3,000 square kilometers per year in the 1970s. And if we look at the development country like Indonesia, Indonesia has in 2017 and 2018 rewetted more than 4,000 square kilometers. It rewetted in 2 years double as much of drained peatlands as entire Europe has done in its entire history. So we are always thinking that we are giving the good example, but we see that countries like Indonesia, with all their problems, they try better than what we are doing. And it is not only the easy stuff that Indonesia is addressing, they are also addressing the highly productive oil palm and pulpwood. It is really amazing what they try to do, and I hope that the current president will be re-elected in April, and that the current Minister of Environment and Forestry stays in place, because these are the people who very strongly drive this process, which is necessary for the world. So to stop or to come to an end, we have this very special character of peatland, which I have described here as cryptic, delicate, diverse, but explosive. How do we have to deal with that in modern times? Of course, we have to increase awareness by focused campaigns in priority regions. We still have large areas in the world that are currently being opened up, of which people are not aware that there are peatlands where we can only prevent things happening as have happened in the last 20 years in Indonesia with all its disasters. We have to do that also worldwide, and for that purpose we have created 2 or 3 years ago the Global Peatland Initiative, where major groups, conventions, but also countries including Indonesia, both the Congos and Peru, are joining each other for supporting the wise use, the wise dealing with peatlands. We need further research. Tropical peatlands are still largely unknown, and therefore it is very good that in November 2018 a new International Tropical Peatland Center has been started by the Congos, Indonesia and Peru in Bogor, Indonesia. We have to find out where the peatlands are. They have to be mapped so that we are able to plan the land use wisely about that. We have to use all modern remote sensing and modeling technologies for that. It is an example of the Indonesian Peat Prize, what we accidentally won last year. But we cannot avoid field work because we cannot see peat in the ground. We still have to do ground truthing on the ground like we have been doing in the past, in the recent past, in the Caribbean. So how unknown peatlands are is maybe best illustrated by the fact that this peatland on the border of Congo Brazzaville and Congo Kinshasa, I always call them because the one is called the Republic of Congo and the other the Democratic Republic of Congo, but the democratic is less democratic than the republic, and so it is Congo Brazzaville and Congo Kinshasa. There a new peatland, a hardly known peatland, has been described 2 years ago of 14.5 million hectares large. And we still discover new peatlands, specifically in Western Amazonia. We have to take care that these peatlands that have not been opened up are not opened up and stay wet. Tropical peatlands in developmental frontiers for deforestation and for oil palm cultivation must have the priority. And in this respect, it is also politically interesting that there has been a Brazzaville Declaration where the Congos commit themselves to protect these peatlands. It is not working completely. For example, the left guy, that is the Minister of Environment of the Democratic Republic of Congo, just 2 or 3 weeks before the signing of this declaration, he has given underhands 3 logging licenses to Chinese logging companies for cash money. Nobody knows how much, but his fellow ministers are angry because he is not sharing the money with them. So we still have a big problem, but the making it public of that these things exist and putting international pressure, and specifically Indonesia is informing and inviting and telling the Congos, don't be so stupid as we have done. You will regret it. Keep these peatlands wet, because if you drain them, you will get enormous casualties, you will get enormous losses economically, and you have to deal with them in a sustainable way. So the peatlands that have been drained must be rewetted. And also their priorities are deeply drained tropical and the large extent of deeply drained temperate peatlands. These are the areas of productivity on this planet where the threats are the largest and the history has caused the largest extent of drained peatlands. And if you have to use them, and you have to use them wet, paludicultures, with as priority intensively used tropical and again temperate peatlands. So in Indonesia, some months ago, an Indonesian platform for paludiculture was created to develop these new land use practices that are compatible with the maintenance of peat, with the minimizing of emissions, and with the stopping of subsidence. So that is actually the message: keep wet peatlands wet, make drained peatlands wet again, and if you use them wet. Peatlands must be wet for the climate, for the land, for the people, forever. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you. Thank you, Hans. That was wonderful. Do you want to unshare your screen? Are you finished sharing?
Yes, I'm finished sharing. Yes. Oh, I can do that, huh? Can I do that?
You can.
No, I do.
You can click unshare. Benjamin says mind-blowing. And we got some great.
But where it is unshare, because you know I have a for one reason I have a German thing and it says something else.
Okay. Gee, I don't know what it says in German.
You can unshare me?
I don't think I can. Oh, I can share.
Huh?
I can share my screen. No. And then, well, can you unshare? Because if not, I can share my screen and then unshare it.
I have no idea.
Let me do this. This will work.
Yeah, something works. I see now your
here we are.
Your inbox. Okay, there's you again. Yes.
All right. Well, we got a lot of great questions here to get to. I have a couple as well, but we're gonna get to these first. One thing I wanted to add before that. Thank you so much, by the way. That was great. And one point I wanted to add in particular about the Mesopotamian mythology that I find so fascinating, because it's only been, you know, in the last 100 years, right, that we've found and then more recently been able to translate some of these cuneiform tablets. So this is kind of new information. And it seems to me that a lot of the kind of thermodynamic errors of Babylonian civilization, you might say, that we're kind of still replicating and that we're just now learning to not do it. So the one thing I wanted to present, which I thought was so cool. So I was reading the Enuma Elish, you know, a Babylonian creation story. And they talk about how, you have Apsu, this freshwater sort of god, and Tiamat, which kind of represents this wildness, but also that like salt water. And then they meet, and that's where all the other gods come from. And it just reminds me of how hydrology forms the atmosphere, and how we're learning about all these things are involved in the climate change, even more than carbon in a lot of cases. But the basic error it says that the gods, they built the city on Apsu. So they built the city on the freshwater, and then they were scared of Tiamat. So then they killed Tiamat, this wildness of nature and these slow moving water that they thought of as chaotic, which is really the slowness of water that gives ability for all this natural order to come up and disperse the chaos, you know. So Tiamat was the mother keeping chaos at bay, and we're still kind of making that mistake where it says they cut up Tiamat and made their civilization out of her body, basically. And we're still kind of doing that with the wildness, but now we're realizing, wow, the natural order isn't chaos that we have to tame and defeat. It's actually what's co-evolved to handle the chaos and protect us as its children. So I just love that. And I think I'm going to write about that more and stuff too, and maybe write an extension of the mythologies. But I find it fascinating, and I appreciate how all of those functions you talked about, in addition to the carbon sequestration and that balance, how it adapts to sea level rise, and the evapotranspiration cools thing, and how these swamplands perform so much of this ordered natural function on the planet. And we're just, so thank you so much for presencing all that. And I think it's so great. And then I have a couple specific questions we'll get to after other folks. All right. So first of all, let's see. Roy asks, would you share the PowerPoint presentation, Hans?
Yes, I can do that. If it keeps almost all pictures are mine, but some, I think maybe four I have stolen from the internet quickly. For example, the one of the pygmies, I have a lot of pictures of pygmies, but they are not digitalized. So I took one off the internet. So for copyright purposes, but if you keep them among the audience, it's not an issue.
Okay. Do you want to like maybe email and then, or you could post it on the well, no, not on the Facebook because you want to keep it private. Maybe folks could I'll take my email in the chat maybe, and folks can email me if they want me to forward it. Yeah, I'll just put my email here in the chat.
Okay.
And then we'll get to the other questions.
Yes.
So here's my email in the chat. Feel free to shoot me an email if you guys want me to forward the presentation from Hans when he sends it. So, all right. Now, Rick earlier in the chat, I don't think he didn't copy it, but he was asking about savanna dwellers. You know, you mentioned forest dwellers. The peatlands played this really particular role because they could see the sky and that whole dynamic. And he was asking about, so what about people that were in the savannas and grasslands? And are you just speaking of forest people, or what came first in our evolution, that type of
I took the forest people because they were living in the forest.
Yeah.
And before Neolithic time, of course, Europe was a forest. There were no savannas.
Right,
of course, human beings have been developed in the savannas, probably. So there have also been people with other perspectives. But I only wanted to stress that if you are living in the forest, and the people first in Europe lived in the forest, they must have had a different perspective from people who live in the savannas. Yes.
Great.
And for these people, a peatland in the savanna or in the steppe. In the savannas, there are not so many peatlands, but in the steppe area, I know very nice peatlands. They are not so conspicuous because they are open with the openness, and they are, of course, they have this wetness compared to the dryness of the dry land. But in the forested area, the peatlands are non-forested, which is, of course, visually a much stronger contrast, because it blocks your view of forest, whereas the openness opens up your view. Yes. That is simply what I wanted to stress, that for people in Europe, the role of peatlands must be special because it was such a deviating thing. It was also deviating for other purposes. for example, very fascinating that in some languages the word for red is the same word as for peatland, because people probably got their iron, which was a major color, from the peatlands where a reduced iron-rich water was coming up that oxidized then at the surface and made the source of the red color. And that's why in several languages in Albanian, and I've forgotten which one, the word for red is still the same word as the word for peatland. And red was, of course, the most important color that was used in the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira. But also there is a 40,000-year-old body that has been found, bones, that is called the Red Lady, because 40,000 years ago these bones were already painted red. Yeah, it is also not a lady, it appears to be a man, but it was, when they found it, they thought it must be a lady when it is painted red. But that illustrates the importance of this color, and that you see then indeed the linkage between the product that they get out of it and the landscape that they name after it, or the opposite.
Right. Great. Benjamin also, thanks Benjamin, mentions that this will be on YouTube as well, so you can share it that way. But I think that Roy was maybe thinking about presenting to like other people. Is that okay if he presents the PowerPoint to other people?
Yeah, I have no problem with it.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we'll do both. All right, and then Benjamin's question here. What type of questions do you wish paleontology could answer about past ecosystems or farming practices that it has difficulty or can't? In short, what are the strengths and limitations of paleontology?
Paleontology?
Yeah, maybe yeah. Maybe he means archaeology as well, too, probably.
Yeah, I include paleontology is for me the comprehensive concept of dealing with the past. Dealing with the past has as big advantage that you can look at time in a time effective way. And when you want to study long-term processes, you can sit and wait and see, but then you can do it yourself maybe for 40 years or 50 years observation, or you can model, and you can try to find out by modeling how things are working on the long term, but the modeling has to be calibrated with real observations. So the most general way, there's another way of dealing with time, and that is what they call space for time substitution, that they look at differences in space and interpret that to be development in time. For example, a zonation in a lake, that you interpret that as a succession, or the existence of cats and monkeys and human beings next to each other. You derive a developmental sequence from that. But time, dealing with time can very effectively be done by looking backwards, where time has been. But the problem is that the things that existed in the past do not exist anymore completely. They only exist via the traces they have left, fossils or whatever that you call them. And you must be aware, and so that is the strength of paleoecology, that you can look in time. Paleoecologists do it in time. We once made a button. So you can study long-term processes that cannot be addressed in another way. But the biggest limitation is that you can only do it with the traces that the past has left. And this is only a part of reality. And there are different, one of my PhDs that I never finished was about a comparison between paleoecology using natural sources, history using cultural sources. And in this way, I wanted to reconstruct the past. There has been a thing in the past. But to address that, we can only use the sources. So I used two different sources. The cultural sources, the things that have been deliberately written down in archives and in maps and in photos and in paintings. and the natural sources, for example, in peatlands where the pollen has come in and a macro fossil and chemistry, etc., etc. And then you reconstruct the past from these two sources. And then I came to the conclusion there are three things. There is history, there is paleoecology, and there is the past. They actually have nothing in common. We must be aware that we cannot reconstruct the reality of the past. And we call people in the past from the Neolithic. We call them after specific stones that they have been using, as if for these people the stones were the most important things. No, these people were thinking in food and in sex, like everybody. But this has not been conserved. And only the stones have been conserved, so we have named these peoples after the stones or the pottery that they have produced. And so it is the limitation of paleoecology is the lack of complete information. You have to use limited traces to reconstruct totality, and that is nice because you can use your creativity and your fantasy, and because nobody can really prove what has happened in the past.
Great, thank you. So Gabrielle Harris says, very interesting talk, Professor Joosten. Could you recommend any good papers on the self-organization of the peatland ecosystems? Thank you.
Yes, I can send you some. On self-organization and on self-regulation. I just wrote a chapter for a Dutch book about self-regulation and self-organization of bogs, of rainwater-fed peatlands. They are fascinating. I think I identified 25 different self-regulation mechanisms that all function on different scales in time and space, and it is very nice. I plotted them all over each other on a logarithmic scale from seconds to millennia and from millimeters to square kilometers. And then you see that these are overlapping and complementary, etc., really covering everything double and to really create stability. That's very, very nice. This,
yes. Okay, I
can send you and I can send you some literature about that. Yes.
Yeah, we are all going to have homework to keep studying. Yeah, that'll be great. Thank you. And yeah, Gabriel, I know I have your email, Gabriel, but you can shoot me one so I remember to add you. Okay, great. Thank you. Roy Straver asks, if you were the king of Europe, what would you do with the current Dutch/German drained peatlands?
Yeah, I would rewet them.
I think you asked that before you talked about paludiculture, but yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. The Netherlands, we have, of course, enormous areas of peatlands that are laying underwater, under sea level. And I saw, where was it? Somewhere in a journal last Saturday, there was a map of the Netherlands in 2300. And when you get this sea level rise, the Netherlands will not be able to keep itself. You cannot make the dikes high enough. You have to give up areas. And they have made an imagination how this would look like, and which areas of the Netherlands would be high enough. Where could you have new polders? Where would be new sea and new swamps? And what was advised that from the next generation, German will be the obligatory first foreign language learned on school, because the Netherlands that is left after 2300 will be much too small to cope with all the people that are already living in the Netherlands, so they have to move to Germany. Wow. But now, yeah, in the Netherlands, the challenge will be to stop further subsidence as quickly as possible, and also to initiate maybe processes that regrow the peat. So in the north from Amsterdam, in Waterland, they have had a project called Omhoog met het veen, high with the peatlands, where they grown new peat mosses and raised the surface already with a few centimeters every year. So you can cope a little bit with rising water levels and rising seawater levels by letting peatlands grow again. Also in the San Jacinto Valley in California, they are hoping that with rewetting and new plant growth, they can let the surface grow again. I don't think we have to be too optimistic about that, because yeah, the sea level rise is going to go fast if we continue like this. Peatlands do not grow that fast, but that is something that has to do. But everywhere it has to be rewetted, and yeah, I think now, for example, in Germany, where I work myself much, we have rewetted 10,000s of peatlands and made them into marvelous new wilderness areas with very high diversity. We have had bird species coming back that have been extinct there for hundreds of years, etc. So you can gain a lot. But on the other hand, we cannot export all our problems to the wild countries. We have also to produce something ourselves, and that is actually the reason that we have been focusing, next to conservation and restoration for wilderness, etc., also on this paludiculture, that you say, okay, let's at least avoid all these negative aspects of using peatlands, but keep them under what we call agriculture, on the productive things, with taking into account that wet peatlands provide much more than only carbon, etc., etc. And we have paludiculture areas, for example, these Svartnum areas that we have created now in Lower Saxony. They are so good, they are so full of red list species. Our first area, the official nature conservation has tried to put this arable field with Svartnum under nature conservation, because it was the best spot with Svartnum papillosum in Germany, and it has so enormous number of rare species as weeds growing in it, that they want to put it under nature conservation. I said, no, this is an arable field. We harvest this stuff, and we're studying this stuff, and it appears to be that we do not destroy biodiversity. So in this way, we can also add nature conservation or biodiversity conservation aspects while having these things productive. Because wetlands have become so rare that all kinds of organisms that grow there naturally have disappeared. And if we make wet agriculture, you get these species back. Not all of them, but a lot of them that are currently very rare. And you get them back for free. That's the nice thing.
Yeah, great, thanks. Benjamin Jansen has another question. I think I might tack one of mine onto his too, because it's related. How many deserts on Mother Earth right now may have been peatlands in the past due to overgrazing? And since you mentioned overgrazing, I was going to ask, so, you know, there's this holistic management approach to grazing where it can be, at least for grasslands, regenerative. So in addition to sort of erosive type grazing, can you also speak to advantages of peatlands over managed grazing that sort of increases the grass health, but that doesn't have the peatland functions? And then he's asking, in addition to that question about grazing, how many deserts on Earth right now may have been peatlands in the past due to overgrazing? And then I'm throwing on my question about different types of grazing and then still the value of peatlands.
Yeah, I cannot answer this question because it is very difficult to prove the existence of peatlands when they are not there anymore, because you lose the traces of peatlands. For example, some 10 years ago, we had a project in Ukraine to rewet also large areas of peatlands, and I was looking for suitable peatlands, and I had a map from peatlands of Ukraine from 1950. And I was in the middle of an area, 5,000 hectares, where should be peat, and I only found potato fields on white sand. So since the 1950s, the peatland had completely disappeared because of intensive drainage and land use. The peatland was only originally 1.5 meters thick, but you lose in 50 years, you can lose all the peat and all the traces. And there are, for Dutch people, there are two interesting books about disappeared peatlands. One is called Verdwenen Venen, that talks about peatlands that have completely disappeared from the landscape, of which you can only recognize that they have been there in the dry landscape because there are still the drainage canals and the peat transport canals. And there is also an, what is this name? It was the book by Johan Borges. I forgot the name. And he reconstructed the peat occurrences in parts of Holland. And all the peat was gone, and they could only find the remnants of peat underneath old churches and old roads where it had been conserved. So the problem with probably like we see it happening now, that we have a direct transition of peatlands to deserts in Mongolia and in Tibet, etc., etc. It must have happened in the past also, but because we do not find traces of the peat, it is oxidized in the same way as all the archaeological findings have been oxidized, all organic material, and you only find the stones back. And this also happened with the peat. So I cannot answer this question.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the thorough non-answer. All right.
If I talk too much,
no, it's perfect. You can talk all you want. Gabriel asks, was the Indonesian government motivated to rewet peatlands converted to oil palms primarily because of the long-term burning peat fires or because of CO2 emissions or what? What was that?
Now, it is certainly initiated because of the fires. And the fires of 2015 were very heavy, and there were 2 million hectares of peat lands burning. And yeah, this health burden is you cannot imagine. So in Kalimantan, whole regions live half a year in smoke. So 50% of all children have lung diseases because they are breathing smoke all the time. And so this is that terrible. But that was also not what mobilized the government. I think that the most important mobilization was the fact that in 2015 and also before in earlier fires, they have simply blocked the economy of Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. And after the fires of, when was that? I forget. When was this fire? I do not know. And there was a fire, certainly in 1997, but since that also very high fires. And this has led to such an enormous economic problems that it became political problems. And the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has then negotiated a treaty that said, if there is a fire in a country and the country does not manage to extinguish it, other countries of ASEAN are allowed to enter this country with their army to extinguish the fire. Of course, the last country that undersigned this treaty was Indonesia, because it has to do with the basis of sovereignty. If you allow a foreign army on your country, but the political pressure internationally became so large that they said, we do not want to have this anymore. CO2 is of course a very interesting thing, because they hope with reducing CO2 to earn money in the same way as Norway has promised Indonesia 1 billion euros or dollars, whatever, if they would stop deforesting and peatland drainage. That was clearly linked to CO2. So they hope to get support money for stopping this. And only recently, this concept of subsidence has become critical. They have become aware that they are losing land. And that is not only the state, but also the companies. For example, Asian Pulp and Paper, that is the largest farmer on peat in the world. They have 800,000 hectares of drained peatlands in East Sumatra, planted with acacia for pulp. They have, a few years ago, built a new pulp factory in South Sumatra, a very huge one, of $3 billion investments, with an amortization time of 30 years. Now they discover that with their rate of drainage, the peat is subsiding so fast that large areas of their plantation will be flooded by the sea in 15 years. They cannot pay off the investments of their plant. And these companies are now like hell, rewetting the areas, raising the water level, reducing the rate of subsidence, and also looking at alternative crops. Alternative crops that grow under wet conditions, that may not have the same productivity as acacia, but which will at least enable productivity to be sustainable, instead of you burn your area and have to leave the area after 15 years as a flooded area where no productivity is possible anymore. So they really, what they call in the Netherlands, the wal keert het schip. The land is turning the ship. And they cannot continue. They are really with their back against the wall. And that's what they feel. And that is an issue that in most countries is not, this awareness is not there, this force. In Germany, we do not have it. In the Netherlands, I have the impression that in the last months, it starts to grow. In the western parts of the Netherlands, the authorities become aware, shit, and we are already so deep below sea level, and we continue 2 centimeters, 1 centimeter every year. We still have 12 or 18 meters to go before it stops, before we have reached really mineral soil. The sea level is rising. We make a pit deeper and deeper. The salt water from the sea is floating into our arable lands. They really see the tide has to be turned, and we are reaching the limit. And this awareness is starting to grow in the Netherlands. But next to Indonesia and the Netherlands, this awareness is not there yet.
Great. I just added I never knew there was that setting. Someone said, can you change it so we can see the questions coming up? So I just changed that. So I think you can even comment. I don't even know what that is, but mess around with it. All right, Rick Armando Ritter. And like I know a lot of these folks, Rick is involved in the Netherlands with the ecosystem restoration camps movement. And let's see, he says, in the Netherlands, I hear the farmers and their allies say that they can only rewet the peatlands when the businesses decide they have found the right crops to keep their economic benefits. What can you say about this strategy? Do you see this as the right way to go about this transition? How does one weigh productivity versus function?
Nou ja, really large-scale operational alternatives are not there yet. You must imagine paludiculture is something that is starting. We are in the Neolithic, I always say, of paludiculture as an agricultural activity. And we see also that it is developing very fast, and we know that it is the direction we have to take. Because, for the simple reason, because we have defined paludiculture as productive land use that minimizes emissions and stops subsidence. And so it is not linked to a specific crop. But of course, you have to identify the crops that you can grow under such conditions that you do not have these negative aspects. A worse situation is that we see a very strong tendency in the Netherlands that they focus on technological solutions that are no solutions. There is a very strong tendency, and it is already in the governmental agreement, that really substantial money is going to be invested in what they call subsurface drainage. So they are going to put drainage tubes in the land, not only to drain the land, but also to make the land wetter. So whereas nowadays the water level under these peat meadows is maybe -40 or -60, and they cannot get the water from the ditches in these peat because these peats are compacted and degraded, they want to put in drainage tubes to higher the water level in summer. And the advantage for the farmers is they can lower the water level in spring and can earlier on the land and bring more manure on it. But in summer, the grass is also growing maybe better. And the water levels are higher, so they expect to have less subsidence and less emissions. The point is that all the studies that until now have been used to propagate this technology are scientifically immature, or not to say it worse. It has not the level of scientific scrutiny that you would expect. Simply, it is not proven. All the things that have been brought forward by Wageningen University is propaganda. It is not based on the facts. Yeah. So, whereas the alternative paludiculture is not worked out completely, the alternative that is now presented is certainly not worked out technologically, and it is not a ultimate solution. I always say, if you are running in the direction of the cliff and you threaten to fall off, it is not a good strategy to halve your speed. You have to stop and turn around. And this subsurface drainage is only a measure to halve the speed of your speed going to the cliff. It is slowing down the problem, but it is not solving the problem. And it is very dangerous to focus on solutions that look nice and can maintain business as usual by solving the problem for 10 years. But the problem is going to come because it is not fundamentally solved. So I think that next to maybe looking at these technological problems, you also have to do substantial research. For example, they decide to provide, I think, 60 or 80,000 hectares with subsurface drainage. And with respect to paludiculture, they promise to have 10 hectares of experimental sites. This is no balance. This is no balance. Both solutions are not ripe. The solutions that they propagate is not a final solution, and the final solution is not investigated. I think this is a wrong strategy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Goose van der Ven says, what types of staple foods can be grown on wet peatlands? Staple foods.
In the temperate zone, not so much yet, because we have not developed them yet. For example, animal food, the experimental station in Zegveld in the Netherlands is at the moment experimenting with using taifa, a cattail, as a fodder for cows. That appears to be rather successful. But we have not a real human crop in the temperate zone that can be grown under wet conditions. The question is whether that is necessary, because we see, for example, that a lot of material production, fuel production, is cultivated on mineral soils, whereas this can also be cultivated on wet peat soils. So you must think also about a swapping of land use, that you say, okay, let's use the good mineral soils for food production and the production of fibers and fuels and whatever. We can also do on a high quality level in the peatlands, where we are not able, at least not in the temperate zone, to do it with wet crops in peatlands. We are looking for it. There are some promising cereals that echinocloa that might grow on that grows under wet conditions. You could use. There are experiments in the Netherlands also with rice and with wild rice. So some things are being done, berries, etc. On the wet conditions. But we have nothing like potatoes or something like that. In the tropics, that is different. There we have, of course, things like sago palm, which is a very good source of starch. We have ilipi nut, a very wet growing tree that produces high quality oil, higher quality than oil palm. But there the problem is it has not been cultivated for such a long time. Not so much selection has been taking place, so it is not producing every year the same amount, etc., etc. So we are sitting actually with the problem that dry land agriculture is based, of course, on experiences and selection of crops and genetics of crops that has been worked out over 10,000 years. And paludiculture is only busy for a few years, but I'm very optimistic about that. We have now organized already two international conferences about paludiculture. Last year one, and 5 years ago one. And the progress that was found in these 4 years is really amazing. It has to do with the fact that we can use the practices, the technologies, etc., that have been developed by modern agriculture with respect to selection and cultivation, etc., that we can apply also to wetland plants. Mm-hmm. So the progress is very fast. Yeah.
Well, related to
but not enough to implement it on a large scale at the moment. Yes.
Right. Related to that, what about fish? Are there fish in these systems, especially the more wet ones?
Yes, in Indonesia, for example, they use fish cultivation as a form of paludiculture. They also call it that way. There, for example, they have made a new ponds in the canals that they have blocked. They have dammed to raise the water level, and then you have between the dams you have water, and they use it for fish. So you can also think of that. Yes. And actually, we have, of course, Southeast Asian production system with rice. Rice has, of course, the problem with methane, and that is also a problem with a lot of wetland plants. You have to take into account this methane problem, but it is not as large as is often thought. But in Southeast Asia, they have, of course, these very closed short circuit production systems that you have rice, and in the rice field you cultivate fish and you eat the rice with fish, and you bring the shit back in the field, and you have a very short rotation, which is actually one of the reasons that you have such an enormous population there on a small area, and because of this enormous productivity and this short rotation cropping. Yes, where fish are involved. So fish you can really indeed also think, yes.
Right. Yeah, and then I guess a lot of these systems, if there's still wetlands, are there also indigenous fish that we should be thinking about before introducing other fish if it's a drained peatland near, say, another system?
Yeah, I do not know so much about fish, but with fish you also have to take care what kind of fish it is. You have these fishes that like to dig in the soil, and if you have a peat soil and they start digging in it, they are mobilizing organic material, they are spoiling the water, they will increase also breakdown of organic material, so you have to be selective.
Right.
We have in the bogs in the Netherlands, we have a fish that is completely exotic, that comes from America, but it's the only fish that can live under such acid conditions. And for example, in the Pale bogs where I come from in the southeast, this fish is a really resource fish for all kinds of rare birds, because they have more fish to eat than normally is available in a bog, because this adapted species can grow and live and flourish under these extremely nutrient poor, humic and acid conditions.
Which fish is that? Which fish?
Umbrea pygmea, the American dogfish.
Ah, okay.
The Latin name is Umbrea pygmea, I think.
Great.
Umbrea pygmea, I think it is.
Yeah, there's a brewery named after that fish. Okay, next question. How can we keep in touch? Benjamin asks, how can we keep in touch with what you're learning and doing? Maybe you have an academia page. I feel a large need to study your work much more. You've touched on so many things that have inspired my curiosity, or disturbed my curiosity, he says.
So we have, in Greifswald, we have actually 3 institutions that deal with peatlands. The university, the Zucker Foundation, and a Dune Society, and we have merged into an institution that's called the Greifswald Mire Center, and they have a website, Greifswald Moor .de, I think. And they have a lot of information material. We have maybe also an English site, I do not know. It's called More Wissen, Knowledge About Peatlands, where a lot of information is there. They have sub-chapters about paludiculture, bog paludiculture, fen paludiculture. So there's an enormous amount of information on this website. So Greifswald More, written together, .de, I think. Huh?
Great. Can you? Someone's asking how to spell it. Do you want to send that in the email and I can forward it, or do you want to just let's type it in the chat real quick? How do you? Is it Greifswald, like Grie, or how do you spell that?
I can.
Yeah. Okay. Nice.
Something like that.
Great.
And they have also a Twitter account in German and in English, so you can follow the recent news. But there is also a lot of information material, etc.
Great. For folks watching on YouTube later in time, speaking of time, it's greifswaldmoor.de. So GreifswaldMoor.de. All right. Thanks, Benjamin. Gabriel asks, in the areas of Russia and Asia that have been covered with permafrost, are vast areas of these places actually peatlands? Earlier, you said living peatlands balance out CO2 and methane as sinks and sources. Do you think that the thawing of permafrost will revive the old peatlands and that they might again come alive and again balanced sources and sinks?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I have just written a chapter in a book for UNEP. They have a series of books every year. Every year they bring a volume out. It is Emerging Frontiers, it is called. And the issue that will be printed this week will have a chapter about permafrost peatlands and their fate in the future with climate change. So it is not an easy question because peatlands create permafrost. They have this so-called cold pump because when they are dry, they insulate, and when they are wet and frozen, they conduct heat. So it means that in summer, the summer heat cannot get in, and in autumn and in winter, the winter cold can get in. So it is a one-directional system. Which creates permafrost and also conserves permafrost. So if we talk about the melting, the thawing, it is called officially, the thawing of permafrost, then we must expect that the peat-covered permafrost areas will be the last to thaw because they are protected by this insulating layer. This does not apply to the zone of discontinuous permafrost. You have a zone of continuous permafrost where the annual temperatures are always on average below zero. So where you have everywhere permafrost, but below there is a zone where there is discontinuous permafrost, where permafrost is only present on very favorable locations. And these locations are often peatlands. And because there, this cold pump, this thermal diode, as they call it, it creates this permafrost. And this area, so that's on the southern part of the permafrost distribution, is actually rather sensitive to climate change. When permafrost thaws, you get, of course, conditions where the area becomes wetter, which will induce more production of methane. The current permafrost peatlands are frozen and rather dry, so there is carbon dioxide sequestration, but only limited because of the cold. But when they are melting, then they become wetter, they collapse, it's called thermokarst, and then in these wet areas more methane is produced. But interestingly, at the same time, also more CO2 is sequestrated because under these warmer, wetter situations, vegetation is growing faster. And actually, we do not have a good idea of the total global balance. We had 2 years ago a big world conference on permafrost in Potsdam, and there we had a policy discussion session where we addressed questions that were interesting for politics. And one of these questions that were asked then is, what can we as permafrost specialists, the combined permafrost specialists of the world, say about the effect of climate change on permafrost? Will it be a positive or a negative feedback, or will it a completely runaway system, etc., etc.? And then the conclusion was actually we do not know it yet. We do not know enough about these processes yet in these areas, which is very frightening, because in the Arctic areas, global change, climatic change is going twice as fast. Temperatures are rising twice as fast as in the rest of the world. We know that there is enormous carbon in these permafrost soils, really much. But we do not know under which conditions it will be mobilized, and if it is thawing, whether the sequestration will prevail or the methane emission, etc., etc., the interference with human activity. So it is a complex issue. Yes. And it has also to do that we do not have a really good overview. It was for me also shocking to read in a recent paper that more than 30% of all scientific quotations about what is happening in the Arctic stem from an area of 30 kilometers around Toolik Lake in Alaska and 30 kilometers around Abisko in northern Sweden. There are only 2 areas in the world where intensive study of permafrost peatlands and permafrost is happening. And we extrapolate these things to the entire world. So there is probably a bias in our observation. So there is really an urgency to study better these things. We know what we can do to prevent things. We should not block water flow, etc., etc., and we should not disturb the surface, etc. We have experience how to deal with permafrost and with permafrost peatlands, but we do not have sufficient knowledge to really plan these things in a sophisticated way.
All right, thank you. And then Gabrielle, who asked that, says, I would like to thank Professor Joosten for his energy. You are a peatland powerhouse. I love it. All right, Rick has a question. By the way, after this last question, do you have your guitar handy, Hans?
Yes.
Okay.
I have.
Okay, great.
I have tuned it.
Special treat. Okay, so stay tuned. Oh, snap, says Benjamin. All right. So our last question, unless another one pops up before a little story and song time to finish, huh, Hans? All right.
Okay, we can do it.
Okay. So Rick says, I read the article about sea level rise. What is the fastest way for the Dutch people to grow the soil level higher in rewetted peat systems? Are peat growing systems able to take in trees, etc., into the peat pack to speed up the growth of land? Couple parts there to that question.
To include trees in the peat, you mean?
Yeah, it was, well, ways of reversing subsidence the fastest in rewetted systems, increasing the soil level. And then also he's wondering about trees and peatlands, if it can be a thing worked into the system, and then how that also affects the growth of the land and the rise of the land.
Yes, to answer the last question, we have in Europe a few species of trees, actually only one, that can really grow well under wet conditions, and that is alder. And if you treat alder well, and we studied that really systematically, then you can have a peat productivity with alder forests that is much higher than, for example, with peat mosses. I once wrote an article about that, about the role of alder in our areas, because our normal peatlands are not forested because we have hardly any trees that are adapted to a continuous rise of water. There are no species in Europe that are adapted to that, except for alder. In North America, you have different ones like black spruce. In Asia, you have larix, and that grows up with the upgrown peat. And our trees do not do that. And they die, except for alder, but alder needs nutrient-rich conditions. But specifically in the Netherlands, you will have, of course, nutrient-rich conditions. Also, this mixture with clay, etc., etc. And then, if you have alder forest growth, they can produce peat in a faster rate than other peatlands. That is also the secret behind tropical peatlands. They are all based on wood, because wood has the interesting characteristic that it has this substance, lignin, of which wood is constructed, and nature has not developed yet a biochemical pathway to break down lignin under water-saturated conditions. We can break down cellulose and other things under water-saturated conditions. There are microbes invented for that. But lignin is a stuff for which there is no good biochemical pathway to break it down under waterlogged conditions. So if you have trees under waterlogged conditions and you can let them grow, and then you have a very effective way to store carbon and to grow peat. Yes.
Wonderful, thank you.
But it will change the peatland meadow area, the open green area, if you plant their trees. It will change the scenery of Holland completely.
Right. All right, great. Well, Gus just left. He said, thank you so much. Really interesting. Thank you so much. And he says, sorry to miss the music. So that's a nice segue.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
You want to tell the story about the Peat Bog Soldiers? Or the Demoorsoldaten?
Yeah, I can do that. The Moorsoldaten. Yeah, it is the song of the Peat Bog Soldiers is a song that originated in 1934 in the concentration camp Burgermoor in Germany. You must know that when the Nazis came into power, they immediately created concentration camps, and a lot of them were in peatlands, because peatlands isolate very good. People do not run away through the open peatlands that are swampy, etc., etc. And people can be used in a useful way to reclaim the peatlands. So there were 13 concentration camps on the German-Dutch border, the Esterweer-Gedose Papenburg complex. And in one of these concentration camps, these were not destruction camps yet. These were concentration camps in the original meaning of the word, that you concentrate there your political enemies. So all the oppositional persons, journalists, intellectuals, artists were brought together. So it was, of course, a terrible situation, but it was also a concentration of so much creative energy and intellect there, that also some very nice things have developed there. And one of the things they did, they organized a circus. It was Circus Concentrazani, where you can see feel the playing of words of contra Nazi, of course, in this word. And in the framework of the first presentation of this circus, there was also a choir created that sung the song of the Peat Bog Soldiers. And this song of the Peat Bog Soldiers had one of the guys was released then in 1934 already, went in exile in Switzerland and wrote a book, The Peat Bog Soldiers, Die Moorsoldaten, which has been translated in many languages. In English, it is called Robert Truncheon. The book, The Moorsoldaten, Robert Truncheon. I do not know why, but they have also, I have, for example, also an Argentinian copy from 1940, etc., a Dutch copy. And this song of the Peat Bog Soldier has become the most important anti-fascist song from that time. It was also made popular by Ernst Busch, who was a very important, I think he was a communist singer, a German singer, who was also supporting the anti-fascist struggle of the international brigades in Spain who were fighting against Franco, etc. And they made this song popular, and also in America it was translated into English and sung by trade union singers, etc., etc. So it's a very important song, this song of the Peat Bog Soldiers. Tomorrow evening I have in winter what I call literary evenings, where I tell about books about peatlands, and the subject tomorrow will be the book The Peat Bog Soldiers, in which this song figures very nice. Interestingly, I found out, and I will start my story with that tomorrow, that the writer of the song text, of course, spent almost his entire life in concentration camps until 1945. And on the last days of the war, the concentration camp where he was in near Hamburg was transported completely on a ship. And I think it where the English did not know that it was a ship with prisoners, and they bombed this ship because they thought it was a military ship. So 7,000 people died in this accident, and only a few hundred of them survived. And one of them was the writer of the song of the Peat Bog Soldiers, who wrote then a book about this catastrophe. So there are some people in history who experience it all. And that is also very strongly connected. I will pick up some stories of other people who were from the beginning there and have survived everything, and what has happened in the 20th century, what was so impressive, and that makes this song so powerful for me.
Wow, great.
Yes.
So you're gonna sing it in German, right? While you're tuning your guitar.
No, I will sing it in Dutch.
In Dutch.
I will sing it in Dutch.
Sing it in Dutch. Perfect. And then we have a lot of Dutch listeners. Yes, yes.
We have no Germans among us.
No, sing it in Dutch, and then while you're tuning your guitar, I'll read the lyrics in English for the other folks.
Okay, that's good.
While you're tuning up, so go get your guitar and let's do this. All right. So, so this way, folks who don't speak Dutch can know the meaning when he sings it. Far and wide as the eye can wander, heath and bog are everywhere. Not a bird sings out to cheer us. Oaks are standing gaunt and bare. We are the Peat Bog Soldiers, marching with our spades to the bog. Of course, soldiers and spades rhyme in the Germanic languages, of course. So, up and down the guards are pacing. No one can get through. Flight would be a death uncertain. Guns and barbed wire block our view. And then the last verse. Wow, so inspiring. But for us, there is no complaining. Winter will in time be past. And on that day we will rise rejoicing, motherland, you're mine at last. And then will the Peat Bog Soldiers march no more with their spades to the bog. So what they're doing here too is draining this peatland, this ancient Babylonian task. So, wow, what a powerful story. Let's hear the song, Hans. All right.
So I will sing the same parts as you have now presented. There are some more couplets in it, but this is sufficient actually. This is the core of the story. Eens over een mens kan kijken, hoe ze troosten, loze soms. Stokale kromme eiken en geen vogel zielt naar ons. Wij zijn de beensoldaten en gaan met onze spade naar been. Schildwacht schotten met stukken stappen langs 4 draden prikkeldraad. Niemand kan ontsnappen, vlucht is zelfmoord, apparaat. Wij zijn de beensoldaten en gaan van onze spade naar been. Maar maar zo lang kan het niet duren. Eeuwig kan geen winter zijn. Eenmaal zwaait de boot hierboven en de tirannie verdwijnt. Dan kan de weeksoldaten niet langer met hun spade alleen.
Yes, yes. A song about loving Tiamat instead of tearing her up with our spades. I love it. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much, Hans. What a wonderful, wonderful pleasure. I gotta, yes.
Oh, you have also one.
But for us there is no complaining, winter will in time be past. On that day we will rise rejoicing, motherland, you're mine at last. And then the Peat Bog Soldiers will march no more with their spades to the bog.
Perfect. Good, good. Well done.
All right, so we can at least hear the melody in English for the non-Dutch folks. All right, thank you so much, so much. I feel bogged up and wonderfly swampy, and yes, for Pete's sake, it's wonderful. Yes, yes. Admired. Yes, I am admiring. Yes.
Yes, yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Hans. You have a wonderful evening, and I'll have a wonderful day. And
yes, you start, and I'm going to prepare my lectures for tomorrow on peatland restoration.
Wonderful. Well, I wish you a wonderful presentation then as well. And they're in for a treat.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. And bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Oh, I wanted to mention to everyone, tune back in next month. And then also next month, we're going to be combining audiences from my Musicology podcast and the Ecosystem Restoration Deep Dive webinar in the first Musicology webinar, which you can hear more about online, but it's wild buffalo and holistic management. So the director of the Savory Institute, Daniela Howard, in a collaborative conversation with Mike Meese, the founder of the Buffalo Field Campaign, so wildlife advocates. And we're going to see what synergies and shared holistic context can be discussed there. So I look forward to seeing you folks there. And then that'll be March 5th, and then we'll have another one of these. Almost solidified the guest, so I won't announce it yet, but the week after that. So yeah, my podcast is at museecology.com, and this webinar is hosted by the Ecosystem Restoration Camps Foundation, and you'll find links to those in the screen after this one. So thanks so much, Hans, and
bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.